I'm Ricky Bevington, President of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and thank you for joining our flash briefing. This is an opportunity for all of us to go deeper into a pressing world issue and understand what it means for us as Americans, for us as Georgians, and of course, for the larger world. Thanks to today's event sponsor, the Samnon School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. We do have people on this Zoom from all around the country, universities, consulates, private enterprises, nonprofits, and other World Affairs Councils from around the United States. We're so pleased to have all of you joining us. Special welcome today to World Affairs Council of Atlanta board members, Joe Bankhoff, Sam Olens, and Jag Sheth, and Alistair Young of Georgia Tech Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. And we are delighted to welcome so many other members of the Georgia Tech community today as well. Our speaker, welcome General Phil Breedlove, a distinguished professor of the practice and Center for European and Transatlantic Studies Senior Fellow at Georgia Tech's Samnon School of International Affairs. He joined the Samnon School after retiring as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and the U.S.-European Command Commander. And in these capacities, he commanded all U.S. and allied troops in Afghanistan, Kosovo, as well as all NATO operations across Europe and the Mediterranean. And as you can imagine, General Breedlove brings a wealth of both deep and recent experience in our world's toughest security and policy issues, as well as leadership in situations spanning both peace and conflict. General Breedlove, we are so honored to have you joining us today.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and it's good to be back with this group.
Well, I know that these folks have a lot of great questions for you, so I'll encourage people to use the Q&A function of their Zoom. And please be brief, because I'll be reading your questions for General Breedlove. He and I are going to spend some time just getting the conversation started. We agreed before this Zoom that we want to prioritize audience questions because you've all taken time out of your day to be here to learn more. So we're going to go over some broad themes, including 3 things that General Breedlove shared with me he doesn't think are being talked about enough as we all look at Ukraine and Russia in this moment. So let's just start with the first one, that you say that this is a contrived problem. What do you mean by that?
Well, exactly that. It is a completely contrived, manufactured, built, whatever you want to call it, crisis put in place by Mr. Putin to try to affect change, to try to, if you want to use Georgia Tech or Georgia boy words, to push us around in the West, to bring us closer to his vision of the world. And frankly, it's a tool that he's used in the past and he learns has worked. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia and continued today to occupy 2 big portions of the nation of Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Since that time, the garrison in Transnistria, the actions they're now taking in Nagorno-Karabakh, and while I was the SACEUR, of course, he invaded Ukraine twice. He continues to now occupy the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. And of course, his forces and his proxy forces are occupying the Donbass region of Ukraine around the towns of Lugansk and Donetsk and the Debaltseve salient. And so in the past, what he has seen is if he can create crises, he can change the way the world treats him and works with him. He uses these kinds of things as his veto to NATO membership for nations. And I want to use a very simple set of terms. You know, if we see bad behavior and we don't address it, and if we let bad behavior be rewarded by giving him what he wants, then we will see more bad behavior. My assertion is that the West did not properly handle the, sorry about that, let me turn that off. The West did not properly handle the incursion into Georgia. The West did not properly handle the incursions into Crimea and Donbass. And so here we are again. And if we allow this to stand, we'll be here again in 6 to 12 months when the next Russian requirement is identified.
And we actually have some maps. Feel free to call for those, General, if you'd like to. We can go full screen. And if you're talking about certain places for our audience to understand the geography of Ukraine, we can have our producers here behind the scene pull those up. So please feel free to bring those up whenever, at any point, we can bring them up again and again.
I think that'll be appropriate in one of our latter.
Okay, great. You know, you say that the West didn't respond appropriately. I was actually in Ukraine in 2019 with some Georgians. So I've seen it, the latest conversations from both the Georgian perspective and the Ukrainian perspective. So what do you mean, like, if you were in charge, how would you have handled it?
Well, for instance, we have often pondered more concrete responses that would include making Georgia or Ukraine more militarily hard to handle. But the refrain is almost always, we can't provoke Russia. And so we tend to take a softer approach because we, quote unquote, can't provoke Russia. I often ask, when are we going to be provoked? And when is the West going to be provoked? And I think that's something we might explore more in the Q&A pictures or the Q&A time today.
You've also said that this is about changing the security paradigms in Eastern Europe and broader. What is Putin's calculation in terms of what does he want? What is his end game in terms of security paradigms?
Well, the bottom line is this is about Ukraine, but it is much bigger than Ukraine. Ukraine is the tool, the fulcrum that Mr. Putin is trying to use now. Again, we haven't, I think, appropriately responded to provocations in the past, and so he sees the tool works. So this is the current tool. So it's really important that we understand that, yes, the sovereignty of Ukraine is important and something we need to continue to be focused on. But the fact of the matter is, this is bigger than that. This is about Mr. Putin. You've heard him say that the greatest disaster of this century is the fall of the Warsaw Pact. He's trying to rebuild that security structure in Eastern Europe that is like the Warsaw Pact, a series of border countries completely under his control, completely at the bidding of Russia to serve as a buffer and to be subservient to what Russia sees as its security demands. And so this is about reestablishing that security structure of Europe, and the piece of Ukraine is a part of it. He has always wanted to bust apart NATO. He has always wanted to decrease the capabilities or the influence of the European Union. You know, when Mr. Putin looks to his east, he sees China, a big country that can deal with individual small countries and very much influence them and force their will on these small countries. When Mr. Putin looks to his west, he sees the EU, he sees NATO, and now he has to deal with larger blocks and a much more capable group of countries as far as negotiations. And so I think he wants to get to an organization and an ability much like China has in its neighborhood. And so we have to realize that this is, again, very much about Ukraine. Don't want to denigrate that, but it's bigger than Ukraine. It's about how the security structure of Europe works.
Absolutely, General. I don't know if it's, maybe you could close your email browser because we're getting some dings. I hope everybody else is on mute. If not, don't worry about it. This is too important a conversation to halt and try to close emails, but we're all living in a Zoom world at the moment. Hopefully we'll be back in person very soon, and we'd love to have you in person. You talked about, obviously, this change of security paradigms. And I'm wondering, since we do have a very diverse audience, if you could actually go back and bring us some history, talking about the Warsaw Pact, maybe for audience members who aren't as familiar with the world that Putin trying to recreate in terms of that international treaty. If you could just share some background, since we are here to learn.
Well, clearly, during the Cold War, we were looking at a much more bipolar world. China was still rising and would become a world power soon, but we were talking sort of a bipolar world with Russia and the Warsaw Pact, that series of nations, many of which are now free, that comprised the Eastern Warsaw Pact, and it was very much a militarily oriented pact, and very much aimed west at NATO in a very offensive way, with a large military force poised to roar through the northern plains of Germany, Poland, etc., into NATO should they need to do that. And during that time, all these little nations, for instance, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, nations that are now free and independent, and some of which are now NATO members, used to be under the control of Estonia. The Estonian commander-in-chief and the president of Estonia once reminded me that Estonia has won its independence from Russia twice, as many other nations in this part of the world have. And so these are nations that used to be completely in this quote unquote sphere of influence that the Warsaw Pact wanted to have. And they have broken free and chosen in their own sovereign rights and capabilities to associate with the West rather than the East. And now they are a part of the Western community, most of them both European Union and NATO members. And by the way, thriving as young democracies, et cetera, et cetera. So the Warsaw Pact was very comfortable to Russia because it represented a block of nations and a block of border nations between them and NATO that was sort of the buffer zone that they could be prepared to fight in if they needed to. So a very militarily oriented organization. Of course, there's two sides to every story. And I see in the notes that some are challenging that the problems are all about NATO expansion.
Right.
I'd love to talk to that in questions and answers. That's a really good subject to go to.
Well, we will be getting to questions. I already see my chat and Q&A blowing up, and I would love to get to everybody. So we'll get to questions just as soon as we can. Please use the Q&A function. It's easier for me to read your question if it's in there. And we can also sort of set it aside so that we can clear the queue, so to speak, if you use the Q&A function. Speaking of community, there's nothing to bring a community closer together than a common enemy. Putin certainly has unified Ukraine since Crimea. And I just wonder if he has spoken publicly about recognizing that. You say he wants to bust up NATO, but some could argue this is great for NATO to get everybody on the same page, NATO and others getting on the same page.
Well, clearly some things are happening that are not, basically, we're probably not on his wish list. It just depends on who you talk to. Again, there are two sides to every story, but there is a lot of indication that Mr. Putin's most recent actions are very much bringing NATO closer. In fact, a few of the large, old NATO nations who have been quite lukewarm on Russia in the past are now making much more profound statements about the costs that Russia will endure if they, in fact, invade for a third time Ukraine in this decade. And so that's important. And a few of the large, more capable neutral nations are having conversations as well. You see some politicians saying this, that, all of this remains to be seen. But what is clear is some of the larger neutral nations, Finland, Sweden, for instance, are having conversations that they haven't had in the past about their need to be better affiliated in a defense way based on the intransigence of Russia and what they're doing with their military.
How does Nord Stream 2 influence Putin's calculations today?
Well, Nord Stream 2 and others are very important because, as you know, Russia is by large amount or primarily a petro economy, and their energy is a tool. It's also a tool that they use to push around nations. Remember that when they invaded Ukraine in the Donbas region of the Ukraine, it was one of the coldest winters in 3 decades, and Russia cut off heating oil and things. Old people died because of the energy politics that Russia played during those times. So the Nord Stream 2 is a huge part of the forward part of their petro economy. In fact, some of the European nations are now understanding that if Nord Stream 2 starts to pump at full capacity, that they individually will be paying a large part of the Russian government's budget, and ergo, European nations, will be funding Russia's military. And so these are things they're now having to come to grips with in this petrochemical piece. But remember, and I hope you know that I always fight to remain apolitical. So I'm not making a political statement, rather a factual statement. Not too distant past, United States was not dependent on anybody else's fuel, oil, and gas. We have made changes, and now we are dependent on foreign fuel and gas again, and some of that is actually from Russia. That's a startling fact to have to deal with.
So you would assert that Nord Stream 2 makes Putin more powerful in the context of today's conversation?
Of course. Again, look back at what he did in 13 and 14 with energy to blackmail nations. And he's done that this year again, raising prices, recalling loans, restricting flows to send messages. And so the more dependent that Europe becomes on Russian oil and gas, and Nord Stream 2 will absolutely make them more dependent. The more dependent that Europe is on Russian oil and gas, the more tools he has to push them around.
I'd like to talk about the title that we selected for this talk, which is Will Russia Invade? And then in parentheses again, to remind our audience that for Ukrainians, this has been going on. This is not a new, obviously it's an escalated problem, but they live day to day with live fire from Russia. I was over there in 2019 and I think April during the presidential election, and people died. Ukrainian soldiers died in the week that I was there. So this is a very much an active conflict. It's a dangerous conflict. Every week.
Even so, Ukrainians have been living with this for a while in 2 ways. The first way is clearly, as you talk about, the line of contact, the western edge of the Donbas around Lugansk, Donetsk, and outside of the Debaltseve corridor.
Do we have a map of that? Could we bring it up?
Yes, let's go ahead and call that up. Call up the Ukraine map because I want to talk to the other piece about what we're talking about.
Great.
So this is something that was used as recently as yesterday in one of our nation's leading pieces of journalism. And so it's a fairly up-to-date one. Now, this is a very complicated map, and I don't want to complicate things. So I'll try to talk to big pictures rather than hand waves. So if you look down in the bottom southeast corner of Ukraine, where it talks about Donbas first and second corps, and then you see the double blue lines, that is typically called the line of contact. That is the line that, as you can see, the blue forces along the west are arrayed to keep the Russian forces and the Russian proxy forces in the Donbas. And that line of contact is hot. People die there weekly, not always daily, but weekly, because there are actions along that line. The Russians know that they and their proxy forces, by keeping the pressure on the line of contact, can tie down the very best Ukrainian forces, which are arrayed against that line of contact. And that is the root of the problems that we'll now discuss. So I want to talk to you here, and we got 10 minutes, and I want to race through this way shorter than that. But I want to talk to you about essentially three options that the forces on the ground now give Mr. Putin. The first one is in the south. So as you look at the Crimean 22nd Corps, as you look at the forces along the northern edge of the Sea of Azov, and the flag that says 8th Guard Army, but those forces that are along that coastal region and the forces that are behind them, this is a sort of southern orientation of forces that give Mr. Putin the ability to run southwest down the coast to build what has been called for years now a land bridge to Crimea. Why is that important? Well, two things Mr. Putin needs. Right on the north side of the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, which is currently occupied by the Russian forces, is the water supply that is so necessary for Crimea. It is on the Ukrainian side of that double line, right on the northern part of the Crimean Peninsula. The second thing that's very important, and you can't see it on this map, but if you look at that, again, the line of contact around Donbass, and if you look at where the double lines hit the coastline of the Sea of Azov, just 40 kilometers to the west of that is the seaport of Mariupol. Mariupol is the New Orleans of America. It is the output, the seaport where almost all of the agriculture of Ukraine goes through that seaport of Mariupol. I cannot verify the number. Other people use this number. That's about 20% of Ukraine's GDP.
Wow.
And so if Russia runs along the coast, they don't even have to take Mariupol, just encircle and cut off Mariupol, continue along that coastline, take the water fields to the north of Crimea, and seal that coastline. That is the land bridge, the southern avenue or southern option that is there. The second option is, if you look at the forces inside the line of contact and to the east of the line of contact, these are all very capable force, a big part of the force, and they are set to reinvade Ukraine through the Donbass. This is a really worrisome approach, because Russia could re-invade Ukraine into the Donbass, marry up with their forces that are already there and the proxy forces inside of the Donbass. And this would be a big show. We have invaded, our forces are in Ukraine, and they would do it with almost no cost. Remember that the last war, the thing that really slowed Mr. Putin down were the moms of Moscow. When their young men and women came home in body bags, the moms of Moscow took to the streets. That he could make that part of this invasion with almost no loss. And then there is enough force there that if he really wanted to make a point, he could enlarge that Donbass pocket. That's the center option that Mr. Putin has. The northern option is the one that's getting a lot of discussion in the last several days, because if you look up into Belarus, you see some Russian units. The red units are Russian units. These are small garrisons of exercise units, et cetera, et cetera. But Mr. Putin in the last 2 days has started moving forces towards and into Belarus to establish a bigger presence. Again, why is this a problem? If you look on the middle of this map of Ukraine, running right through the A in the word Ukraine, is this large lake looking affair, okay? And if you follow that to the north and all the way to the south, it's actually a huge, let me say it one more time, huge river, the Dnieper River. It is nearly impassable to land forces. For Russia to try to fight across that river would cost them a lot of, they would need a lot more force than they have now to do that. But if you look to the north, Russia can drive across Ukraine into Belarus and sit right on top of the capital of Kyiv in Ukraine, literally hours away from the capital of Ukraine, and do this largely unopposed. Again, no body bags to account for, but huge, significant impact. Can we call up the Belarus map, please?
Before we bring up that map, I do want to say that we did get permission to use that map. Is that correct, General? And that was from the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So now if you look at where Russia is, the town of Kursk, and then Kinsky, and then this is in the southeast portion of this chart, you can see that Russia can move way west over Ukraine. And now as they enter into Belarus, they don't have to go very far with their forces, and they're sitting right on top of Kyiv. See at the bottom of the chart, in the country of Ukraine is Kyiv. And now they can cross this river on Autobahn bridges, move swiftly into the Belarusian area and sit hours away from Kyiv with a large military force. And imagine the political pressure then on the government of Zelensky. So why are there three options? I think it's very much, again, contrived. If he wants to simply put huge pressure on the government of Kyiv and thumb his nose at the rest of the world, he can take the northern route and park right on top of Kyiv. If he wants to actually bust up NATO and others, he can take a large land force into the Donbass, relatively unopposed, and then expand the pocket in a dramatic world show of force and power. If he wants to really economically strangle Ukraine, he can go along the southern coast and cut off Mariupol, and could ostensibly continue along the coastline and completely cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and that would be dramatic to Ukraine's economy. So he has built options. He's arrayed a force, and now he is poised to use whatever he thinks is best suited to affecting the change that he demands from the West. You can take the maps down now. We can use them in the Q&A if you want.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was extremely educational to be able to look at the map. And, you know, the question that comes to mind is, how did we get here?
Well, I think we go back to some of the comments that are in the chat. I haven't looked at the questions yet, but again, we have to be intellectually intelligent enough to understand there is two sides to every story. And Mr. Putin, I believe, to some degree, really believes that Russia was wronged after the fall of the wall. He has said completely straightforward in speech after speech that the greatest catastrophe of this century is the fall of the Warsaw Pact. And so now he's trying to rebuild that paradigm, that Western security structure that favors Russia's concerns. And Russia's concerns are that NATO is pushing on them. And, you know, Russia has been invaded in the past by Napoleon and others, so they know the invasion route. And these are things that are real in their history. I completely disagree with Mr. Putin on his statements about NATO encroachment. And if we want to spend time in the Q&A, I would ask somebody to challenge me on NATO encroachment. I'd love to talk about it. But
Well,
Mr.
why don't you,
feels that Russia is an aggrieved nation, that NATO is pushing on them, and he wants to build, you've heard all the words, legally binding assurances, treaties, all these things that would lock down the West, put the West back in the box they were, take the sovereignty away from those border nations and return them to Russia's quote unquote sphere of influence. And that is why we are where we are.
we have extraordinary questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to curate them to the best of my ability. Please understand I can't get to everything, but the maps we just looked at were very much about on the ground military action. Let's go to sanctions for just a moment. Andrew Navratil asks, so will economic sanctions be a sufficient deterrent or penalty for Putin? If not, what should the US NATO do to deter or penalize him for invading?
So I'm going to answer the question with the question. Have our sanctions changed any of Mr. Putin's behavior to this point? And I will go ahead and answer rhetorically, no. Here we are again with another contrived, completely fabricated crisis to move forward. This is something that I've talked an awful lot about and I teach about over at the Sam Nunn School. I'm going to grossly simplify a nation's power. I do this because I'm a fighter pilot and fighter pilots need things simplified. Okay, so I use DIME, the American coin: diplomatic power, informational intelligence power, military power, and economic power. When Mr. Putin attacks a nation, and we could go back to 13 and 14 and look at how he attacked Ukraine, intense diplomatic power to discredit the Poroshenko government, to discredit what the people's will in Ukraine. An intense disinformation campaign to say that the United States actually fomented the Maidan revolution. We call it the Maidan. The Ukrainians call it the revolution of dignity. They've got their dignity back by getting rid of the Russian puppets and bringing in a government that they elected. So intense diplomatic pressure, intense disinformational pressure. And then militarily, they did something that we thought was over since 2008, and that was they used their land force to invade a country and change internationally recognized borders twice. They invaded and continued to occupy Crimea, and they invaded and continued to be in and facilitate their proxy forces in the Donbass. And then economically, we talked about it already. In one of the coldest winters in 30 years, they changed the paradigm on delivery of fuel oil, heating oil, and gas to Ukraine, and people died as a result of it. So their attack on Ukraine was all across a nation's capabilities, diplomatically, informationally, militarily, and economically. How did we reply? Did we mount an intense diplomatic campaign? No, we threw it over the transom to Mr. Hollande and Mr. Merkel, or Miss Merkel, and said, this is yours, it's in your backyard, take care of it using the Normandy formats and get on with it. Did we answer their disinformation? No, we have gotten out of that business years ago, and at an international level, our government is actually incapable of answering at threat speed disinformation. Militarily, what did we do militarily for Ukraine at the time? Well, we sent them field rations and blankets. And then a little while later, we sent them medical supplies. If you've ever eaten our field rations, you know why we sent them medical supplies. That's a joke, by the way. And then later, we finally started sending them some small amounts of weapons, but not much. So very, very small military reply. What did we do with Russia? We did sanctions, extra sanctions, wider sanctions, deeper sanctions, special sanctions, very special sanctions, additionally, very special, very, very, very special sanctions, and more sanctions. That's what we do with Russia. We do sanctions. So they attack us broadly across all of national power. We reply always in a silo. And I wonder why we would expect anything to change, because clearly what we have done so far has not changed Mr. Putin's calculus. And frankly, I believe that we are on the verge of doing that again. I will give great credit to Mr. Blinken and others. There is much more diplomatic work being done now, and the allies are beginning to come on board. That is really good. We are still not approaching answering the disinformation. Our government is just not organized to do that. Militarily, we are doing some things. In conversations in the last 2 days with Washington, I think we've obligated about 60 million of the $650 million that has been allocated to help Ukraine. So we're about 1/10 of the way into that work. There's a lot more that needs to be done there, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the sad news also is, again, we seem to be relying most heavily on a new sanctions package. And for some reason, which I cannot understand, we just publicly took probably the most powerful sanction off the table, the connection to SWIFT. And I'm not sure why we did that. I can talk more about that later, but I'm just not sure why we did that.
Well, hopefully we'll have time for that. I do want, first of all, congratulations. Our audience has extraordinary questions. I'm trying to consolidate and scroll through, but there's the expression, the future of Europe will be determined in Ukraine. So what the conversation we may be having today may be really the beginning of hopefully the next chapter or the end of Europe, whatever that is another way of saying that the future of NATO will be determined in Ukraine. NATO has got to get this right? Is that what the stakes are here?
Well, I am not a balanced answerer for that question, having been the commander of NATO's military and myself having served 8 times in Europe, both of my daughters born in Germany. I am very much attached to our European partners. I'm very much attached to NATO, et cetera, et cetera. So the audience has to understand from who they are getting this answer. I think it's incredibly important that Europe take a stand here to say enough is enough. And clearly, if we completely let him off the hook again, Iran, China have all seen how to work the United States, contrive a disaster, and the United States and the West will move. And so I think it's important at this point that we address this in a manner that might have stopped it back in 2008 if we'd have done it, in a manner that might have stopped this and we wouldn't be here if we'd have handled 2013 and 2014 better, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you need to understand the source of the answer. But yes, I believe that how the security infrastructure in Europe works is going to be watched and understood by both good and bad across the next several months. And I think it's important that we step up and take out the tools other than the economic to begin to address Russia's all of government, all of nation attack.
I noticed on the map that there were different color codes, and we might bring the Ukraine map up again. There are different color codes for which troops belong to which forces. There's Russian.
Yeah, and actually the update has taken off some of them, but let's bring it back up.
Okay. I guess my question is, where are NATO, and since this is an American audience largely, on the NATO or American troops on the ground? Do we have people on the ground on this map? We as in the United States?
Yes, we do, but it's very small. Okay, so if you look on the extreme western edge of Ukraine, it's not labeled, but just above the chart with the colors on it is actually Poland. And we have US troops in Poland. Just to the east of Poland, inside of Ukraine, is the garrison and town of Yavoriv, Yavriv, Ukraine. And we have not only American troops there, but NATO troops there that are training with Ukrainian troops. And frankly, we learn a lot about how the Russians are fighting along the line of contact. We learn an awful lot about Russian tactics, techniques, and procedures by talking to the Ukrainian soldiers that are on that line of contact facing the Russians every day. So we have folks there in Yavriv. And I'm not passing anything classified. It's talked about in open press, but in other locations further east in Ukraine, we have special forces and a few other teams. But these are training. These are all training detachments. What we do not have is combat units in Ukraine. We have multiple training locations and training detachments, but we do not have forces in Ukraine that are there to face an external enemy.
We have a question from Al Shams who asks, what are the military capabilities of Ukraine and their willingness to fight?
So put that map back up. I'm sorry. This will be really important. This will be really important. So the military of Ukraine today is drastically different than the military of Ukraine in 13 and 14. They have spent that time getting better equipped, and better trained. In fact, the military of Ukraine is far larger than several of our biggest NATO allies at this point, and to a certain degree, far more capable on the ground than some of our other allies at this point. But if you look at this map, the fight with the Russians is along that line of contact in the southeast corner, the Donbass line of contact. And so if you look at those three blue rectangles and one blue triangle along that line of contact, the very best forces of Ukraine are there because there's a live war going on there every day with Russia, okay? And so this is both good and bad. The forces are way better and way more capable and willing to fight, but they're there. So if you look at all the forces on the northeast side of this map and the southeast side of this map, they are all arrayed to easily go around the forces in Donbass. And if the Russian and proxy forces in Donbass keep the pressure on, the good forces that are arrayed against them can't detach themselves and move to defend the rest of the country. So let me just in a broad hand wave answer your question. The military, the land forces of Ukraine are capable. They're much better than they were in the 13 and 14. And they have the will to fight. There's no doubt about it. Now, the two absolute opposite observations. The Ukrainian Air Force is not nearly as capable and cannot defend its airspace. When Russia invaded into the Donbass, Russia owned the airspace over the Donbass. And on the water, the maritime forces of Ukraine will not be able to stand against Russia. And so while they have developed a pretty capable and very spirited land force, they need a lot of help defending their sovereign air and sea space.
We do have a question actually about the weather, and troops must be freezing, but tanks operate better on frozen earth. How does weather affect tactical decisions on both sides?
You have just said it. I mean, when some of these areas, especially up around the Dnieper River and some of the areas in the Donbass region, are very moist, not swampy, but this is not firm ground. And this is not tank ground. It is in the winter when it's frozen. And so the observations that are being made in the open press about the importance of frozen ground and timing of what Mr. Putin might do, they're all accurate.
Casey Kitchens asks, is there any reason to believe a limited nuclear strategy will be considered from either Russia or NATO?
Well, the real answer is no. But anytime you're dealing with Russia, you have to understand how they talk about nukes. Russia will want to fight this fight on Ukrainian soil. If any group of nations were to start firing on Russian forces east of the line of the internationally recognized border, then anytime you do that, Russia has always threatened that if they appear to be in a bad situation, that nukes are a part of their plan. This is the whole philosophy that some believe and some don't believe, called escalate to de-escalate. If you start winning, I'm going to nuke you until you stop, kind of thing. Now that is, I don't see that here, but anytime you deal with Russia, you have to understand how Mr. Putin and how all of their military have talked about it. Mr. Putin and Mr. Gerasimov, who leads the military forces, have more than once said that nuclear weapons are a logical extension of the conventional battlefield. You can make your own judgment from that.
Since we're talking about words coming from Russian leadership, what is the latest? I read that the Ukrainian government had received maybe some criticism for coming off as a little bit too casual or at least relaxed. Just in recent days, what are you hearing from Ukrainian leadership?
Well, there certainly was a time early in this business where there were words coming from Ukraine that indicated that they thought there was not going to be an invasion. This was about bullying and arraying a force to force the conversation to go their way, et cetera, et cetera. I think I'm not going to speak for Ukraine. I will just regurgitate what I'm seeing in the press. As Mr. Putin has continued to pour force and capabilities and enablers and all those things that they would need into the area, I think you now see a Ukraine that is a little bit more concerned that there might actually be an invasion. And if, depending on who you're listening to, they're beginning to say things like our president and our Secretary of State have said, which it looks like this is going to happen.
There's ground invasion, there's air invasion, and then there's cyber warfare. What are Russia's cyber war efforts against Ukraine? This is another question.
So I would rephrase that question along the following lines. I would say that there is kinetic warfare, which is land, air, and sea. And then there is what some people call gray zone, what NATO likes to call hybrid, what I like to call war below the lines of kinetic response. And that is this whole, let's just go ahead and adopt NATO's word, this whole hybrid war that's out there. And the hybrid war is bigger than just cyber. Cyber is a huge part of it, but it's also disinformation, it's graft, it's collusion, it's bribery, it's disinformation on an international scale and a local scale. All of these things are this gray zone or hybrid war. And Mr. Putin has been waging that in Ukraine for some time now. It's intensifying. He's, oh, by the way, fighting those wars in our capitals. And we could sit down if you wanted to on a whole nother show and talk about what Russia's doing in the hybrid war against the United States, against London and England and other places. This is the tool du jour for him because nobody's returning fire. Nobody's imposing cost on him for his actions in the gray zone. And so he certainly is using that, and it's only getting worse. You saw the cable in Europe in the North Sea cut. That's a message. You know, you want to be disconnected from the rest of Europe, we'll just cut all these cables. We caught him soon enough. They were trying to do a false flag action in Ukraine. That was uncovered. There was this rumor about America starting a chemical war, and then those guys were caught with their chemical weapons that were going to do that. I mean, Russia's going to use every tool they can in that diplomatic, informational way to discredit everything the West does and blame everything bad that's happening on the West. And so it's going to go on.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I know that you are actually expected to testify before members of Congress today. So I want to get to as many remaining questions as we have before we have to let you go so that you can influence world policy. A question about the Kiev option that you discussed. This question is, would you see the government moving to Lviv? How do we say that city? That's north of Kiev? Lviv. Okay, and I think that's north of Kiev. And potentially Russia using that as a way to cut Ukraine into West Ukraine and East Ukraine, and then it says annexed to Russia. Could you comment on that idea?
Okay, may I not be ugly, but I think it's a bit of high-end speculation. But that does not mean that it may not be appropriate. So for the government to abandon Kiev and head west is an incredible signal that I don't think any government wants, So I think that's a very drastic option. It could actually happen. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that's pretty drastic. But think about it. This whole business of being able to motor through Belarus at almost no cost and then park a large ground force hours away from a capital. That would be like Russians in North Carolina poised to go up 95. Okay. And so that would bring incredible pressure on the Ukrainian government. And that's why I believe these options, the North, Center, and South, are options that are designed around strategic goals. Are we just trying to collapse the Zelensky government? Are we trying to bust up NATO and EU? Are we trying to cut off Ukraine economically from the world? There are options there, tools that Mr. Putin has built in order to affect the change that he wants in the West. And how we respond to him, I think, will help us to understand where he's going. But clearly he's feeding all of these options because we see amphibious ships coming from the Baltic Sea and the North Sea they've already passed through the English Channel and they're on their way to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. That will bolster his option in the South. We see forces moving through the North to and through Belarus already. That enforces the North. And then we see hospitals, logistics trains, fuel bladders headed towards the force in the center. That is feeding that option. So I don't think that we can assume any of the three options are still it because he's making each one more viable day by day.
So Putin's options are growing. Are NATO's options growing?
Okay, now I'm going to speak for Phil Breedlove and no one else. All right. So this is my opinion and should not be transferred outside of this.
Just to clear, is this on the record or this is?
Sure, that I assume I'm on the record. I've said this.
Yes, you are on the record. Okay.
I've said this externally before. I want to congratulate our current administration for doing some things we haven't done well in the past. We are, I think, building consensus among allies to take appropriate action. We have gotten some of NATO's oldest allies who have been somewhat softer on Russia in the past to take a more strident position. So we are working on some things diplomatically. We're not answering the information campaign. I've said it now, this will be the third time. Our government is incapable and not organized to answer the information campaign. Militarily, we are doing some things. Are we doing enough and are we doing the appropriate things? That paper will be graded by the professors after the fact. And we are very much, again, sort of relying on the economic package. So I don't mean to be negative, but I see this as a fairly passive set of deterrent measures. And I would like to see us move to a more active set of deterrent measures. Every day, Mr. Putin is adding to the problem. What are we adding to the problem? Have we moved any forces forward in NATO regions? Are we working now to build Ukraine's capability to defend themselves in the air? Are we taking the right actions to help Ukraine build its capability to defend itself in its sea and maritime spaces? And I would, Phil Breedlove, I would like to see a more active set of deterrent measures than we're currently taking.
Unlike Putin, the leaders of NATO are responsible and accountable to the citizens who represent those countries. Do you think that NATO countries have a stomach for more active military engagement?
I mean, you just stated sort of indirectly a very obvious thing that needs to be discussed because a lot of people don't think about it. Russia is an autocracy. I actually believe it's a kleptocracy, if you know what a kleptocracy is. But it is a autocratic, kleptocratic government that has speed in the things they do because they don't have to answer to Congress. They don't have to answer to their people. They basically answer to their own personal desires and concerns. We in the West have it right. It doesn't work well sometimes, but we have it right. We have checks and balances. We have to deal with what our people think, what our Congress think, what the people who control the purse, i.e. Congress, and others think and do. And so we are a bit ponderous when we look at the speed of our response. But I think we are appropriate in the way we do this. Sometimes people used to beat me up about how slow NATO was to make decisions. Once or twice I saw NATO slow to make a decision, and in the end it turned out it was the right decision. Okay, so again, two sides to every story. But in this instance, I do believe that we need to learn from the past. If we go 0D, 0I, 0M, and massive E in our response, we're probably going to get exactly what we have gotten for the last 20 years. We need to be more balanced in our reply. And we need to develop the capability to work at threat speed when it comes to the information campaign. A quick question. When Russia shot down MH17 in eastern Ukraine, how long did it take America to debunk that story? I'm not going to wait because we'd waste time. It's a trick question. We never did. We left it to the Netherlands and Malaysia to answer that question because it was primarily their people on the airplane. And how long did it take them to definitively, and they did a magnificent job, but how long did it take them to definitively debunk that lie? 2 years later, they had this conference that just did an amazing job at debunking the lie, but we knew it was a lie within hours of it happening. 2 years later, there was no effect. Nobody held Russia accountable for shooting down MH17. Because 2 years later, who cares? There are 15 more lies into their disinformation campaign. So we need to develop a national capability to answer disinformation at threat speed, not at bureaucracy speed. And we don't have to lie to do that. If we simply address the truths, we could change the narratives and do it better. We're just not organized to do that. We had a GEC, the Global Engagement Center, that was built to do that, and it has been twisted and turned to a very different purpose, and et cetera, et cetera. We're just not good in a democracy at responding to disinformation.
General Breedlove, you have left us with so many more questions and so much information. So we have to thank you very much for joining us. We're giving you a virtual applause right now. Thank you so much. And thank you to today's sponsor, the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. If you are not a member of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, you are missing out on our exclusive member programs. This today was public and we will publish it on our YouTube channel. We do have member exclusive programs as well. Next Thursday at noon, members are invited to a virtual conversation about the future of work. And you can learn more about council membership at wacatlanta.org. Thank you also to today's behind the scenes team, Anna Petrova, social media manager, Laura Brower, program associate, and Henna Rennie, producer of today's Zoom and acting program director. And once again, General Breedlove, you have a busy afternoon speaking to members of Congress. Thank you for your service to our country, which continues now in private civilian life. And we're so grateful to you.
And if I could just say thank you to all assembled. I learned much from these. And if there's any way to get the texts that were in the chat and the question, I learned so much from what you're asking, because I need to be a good communicator and I may be not telling the story correctly. So if there's any way you could archive the two series, the chat and the Q&A, I would love to be able to learn from that and maybe even get back to some of the folks. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
We'll be sure to send you the full transcript. So thanks again, and we hope to see you soon speaking to the council. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.